Join me as I dive into the mysterious final days of Jean-Baptiste Carrier and try to uncover what really happened. Start with a surprising fact about Jean-Baptiste Carrier's role during the French Revolution to pique interest, outline the challenges Carrier faced during the latter part of his life, including political opposition and public perception, explore the events leading up to Carrier's downfall. Detailing his actions and the reactions they provoked, the guillotine was supposed to be the perfect instrument of equality. One clean drop. One flash of steel. No bloodlines. No mercy. No exceptions. But on December 16, 1794, when Jean-Baptiste Carrier knelt before that same blade, something ancient refused to obey. The crowd, 30,000 Parisians, starved for justice, waited in silence. The executioner released the rope. And the blade stopped. Halfway down. Frozen. The air itself went still, like history had inhaled and refused to exhale. The executioner tried again. And again. But the steel jammed, catching light from the winter sun like a defiant omen. The crowd began to whisper. They said the guillotine was rejecting him. That God himself was withholding death, as punishment. Not for what Carrier had done to kings or soldiers, but to the innocent. He called it vertical deportation. A phrase so sterile, it could only have been invented by a bureaucrat of hell. But behind those two words lay the screams of thousands, priests, nuns, farmers, children, tied together and drowned in the Loire River. The locals called it les noyades de Nantes, the drownings of Nantes. But witnesses called it something else. They said the river became a throat that swallowed the Republic's sins. That even the current began to rot. Now, the man who had engineered death on an industrial scale was being offered no escape, no clean end. And as the guillotine stalled again and again, some whispered that France itself, the new, enlightened, republic, was watching its own reflection in that trembling blade. Because Carrier wasn't just one man. He was a mirror. A reflection of what happens when revolution forgets reason. The guillotine finally fell that day. But not before history marked him, and every regime after him, with the same invisible scar. The machine will always turn on the hand that feeds it. And that's where this descent begins. Because what happened to Jean-Baptiste Carrier was not just punishment. It was correction. A warning buried inside time, for every empire that learns to love its own cruelty. Now we go back, before the blade. Before the screams. Before the drowning began. To understand how one man, and one idea, could turn an entire nation into an altar of blood. Before the guillotine jammed, before the river filled with bodies, Jean-Baptiste Carrier was not yet a monster. He was a loyal son of the revolution, a man who believed, with terrifying purity, that violence could purify the world. France in 1793 was not a country, it was a fever. The monarchy was dead, the church dismembered, and reason itself was worshipped like a god. In the streets of Paris, people spoke in slogans instead of thoughts. Liberty, equality, fraternity, three words that once held meaning, now turned into weapons sharper than the blade itself. Carrier was sent to the city of Nantes to cleanse it of counter-revolutionaries. He arrived not as a soldier, but as an idea. A living extension of the revolution's cold logic, to kill not just enemies, but entire ways of thinking. They gave him authority, unchecked, absolute, and holy. And that's when something shifted inside him. When a man believes he is carrying out the will of history, morality dies quietly in his hands. Carrier saw himself as an engineer, not an executioner. He didn't want chaos, he wanted efficiency. So he created a system. A rhythm. A formula for death. First came the committees, papers, names, signatures. Then the confessions, forced, falsified, forgotten. And finally, the process. He looked at the guillotine and decided it was too slow. Too visible. Too merciful. So he invented something new, vertical deportation. Barges fitted with trap doors. Wooden coffins disguised as boats. Each one carrying priests, farmers, children, traders, he called them, into the middle of the Loire River. And then, the plugs were pulled. The sound of thousands drowning together, slow, muffled, mechanical, became the background noise of the Republic. Carrier didn't flinch. He said, "We must destroy in order to purify." But what he didn't realize was that he was building more than a killing machine. He was creating a prototype. A template for every modern government that would later hide mass murder behind paperwork, slogans, and bureaucratic language. Carrier thought he was serving freedom. But in truth, he was serving the machine, the one that feeds on obedience, fear, and silence. And as his river of corpses widened, the revolution began to stare back at him, realizing what it had become. Because the true horror was not what Carrier did. It was how easy it was to convince others to help him do it. By the winter of 1794, the revolution had begun to eat its own creators. Paris was sick of blood. The same mobs that once cheered the guillotine now trembled every time they heard its fall. And deep inside the city, the men who built the new republic were beginning to whisper, "Who will the blade choose next?" Jean-Baptiste Carrier was summoned to Paris under the pretense of justice. But it was never about justice. It was about containment. The revolution needed a scapegoat, someone to absorb the sins of the system, to make the machine look innocent again. And so they chose Carrier. His trial lasted 11 weeks. 11 weeks of horror, silence, and revelation. Witnesses came forward, their voices trembling as they described the drownings, the children tied together, the priests praying underwater, the laughter of soldiers watching from the banks. The courtroom became a theater of ghosts. Carrier sat unmoving, a thin smile cutting through his face like a scar. He didn't deny what he'd done. He defended it. He said the people he drowned were enemies of liberty. That purification required sacrifice. The crowd gasped. But the judges didn't. Because deep down, they knew, he was only echoing their own creed. He hadn't betrayed the revolution. He had perfected it. And that was the real terror. They weren't punishing a madman. They were burying a mirror. You see, every system built on purity eventually turns inward. When you promise a utopia, you must destroy anything that threatens the illusion, even the ones who helped create it. And so, Carrier became the offering. The sacrifice to prove the revolution still had a soul. But the irony ran deeper than any courtroom could contain. As witnesses spoke, a strange unease grew among the people. For the first time, they began to realize that the line between revolutionary and monster was made of paper, and that anyone could be rewritten into an enemy. As the trial dragged on, the air thickened with an invisible weight, the weight of every truth that could no longer be hidden. And when the final sentence was read, the crowd didn't cheer. They stared. Because in that moment, they understood something that would echo across centuries: no regime kills its monsters. It merely recycles them. And now, history was about to recycle him. Back to the square. Back to the machine. Back to the blade that refused to work. December 16, 1794. Gray sky. Bitter wind. The kind of cold that gnaws through bone. Jean-Baptiste Carrier was led through the streets of Paris, bound and silent, the same way he once paraded his victims through Nantes. But today, the city did not cheer for revolution. It watched in silence, the kind that feels like judgment. The scaffold loomed ahead. The guillotine, that flawless invention of reason, gleamed like a cathedral altar. Every eye watched the machine that had devoured so many lives. And then, it refused to work. The first drop, jammed. The crowd gasped. The second, stuck halfway. A low murmur began to ripple through the sea of faces. Even the executioner froze, pale, trembling. For a moment it was as if something unseen had gripped the blade and said, "Not yet." The crowd began to whisper the unthinkable, that the guillotine, the so-called god of equality, had turned against its own priest. That fate itself had risen to reject the man who drowned a nation. Carrier's eyes darted upward, and for the first time, witnesses said, his composure cracked. He was staring not at the crowd, but at the blade, the same blade he had worshipped in spirit. The same steel that symbolized his faith in logic, order, progress. And now it betrayed him. Some claimed they saw him mouth a prayer. Others said he cursed the heavens. But whatever he said was swallowed by the roar of the crowd, a sound that wasn't joy, but horror. Because at that moment, everyone watching realized the same truth: the machine wasn't broken. It was answering. It was answering for the drowned children. For the nuns. For the priests. For the river that had become a graveyard. The executioner adjusted the rope again, sweat dripping from his hands. A shout rang out, "Do it! Finish it!" The blade dropped once more. And this time, it fell clean. The head of Jean-Baptiste Carrier rolled into a basket darkened by the blood of his victims. The crowd erupted, but the celebration felt hollow, like they were cheering at a funeral for something larger than a man. Because in that instant, everyone understood, the revolution had not ended with Carrier's death. It had simply claimed another victim. He had been the hand of the machine. Now, he was its offering. And yet, in a strange, unsettling way, the story wasn't over. Because what died that day wasn't just a man. It was the illusion that evil always wears a face. When the blade finally fell, it did not sever evil from the world. It merely changed its uniform. Carrier's corpse lay still, but his idea, the idea that order can justify horror, did not die. It evolved. It adapted. And it slipped quietly into the bloodstream of every institution that came after. You see, the revolution didn't just invent a republic. It invented the mechanics of control. A system where cruelty could hide behind paperwork, where obedience felt like virtue, and where death could be delivered with a signature instead of a sword. Carrier had called his drownings vertical deportations. The world learned that lesson. And in the centuries that followed, governments would use cleaner words: re-education, cleansing, restructuring, security. But the rhythm was always the same: take the unwanted. Name them the problem. Erase them quietly. Call it progress. And we, the people, have been trained to applaud it. We call it efficiency, patriotism, even peacekeeping. But the ghost of Carrier smiles every time a man is destroyed in the name of a noble cause. Because what began on the Loire River did not end in France. It became a template, a silent algorithm of control that transcended empires, flags, and ideologies. Governments learned to weaponize morality. Corporations learned to manufacture obedience. And religions learned to baptize fear. That's the real revolution, not the one that stormed palaces, but the one that stormed the human mind. The invisible one. The one that taught people to police their own thoughts, to kneel to symbols they don't understand, to drown others for being different. And here's the truth you were never meant to hear: the machine never died. It just stopped needing blades. Today, it lives in algorithms that decide what you see. In headlines that shape what you think. In institutions that demand your loyalty while feeding on your silence. And if you're still listening right now, then you've already begun to see the pattern, the same rhythm that began with the revolution still echoing through your own life. You were never meant to hear this. But now that you have, there's no going back. If you feel something waking up inside you, a flicker, a defiance, a quiet sense that you've seen through the veil, comment this phrase twice below to lock it in: the machine ends with me. Write it twice. Make it real. Because once you do, you stop being part of history's repetition, and become part of its correction. The machine doesn't need soldiers anymore. It builds its empire inside the human mind. And every obedient thought, every silence, every surrender, is another drowned soul in the modern lawyer. You see, Jean-Baptiste Carrier didn't start as a killer. He started as a believer. He believed in the revolution, in reason, in progress. He believed that if he simply obeyed, if he did what history demanded, he would be righteous. And that's how every system of control survives. It convinces good men that obedience is virtue. They don't ask you to commit atrocities. They just ask you to agree. To stay quiet. To fit in. To trust that someone else knows what's best. And little by little, that trust becomes a chain. Every time you silence your doubt to protect your comfort, a new link forms. Every time you accept the official story instead of seeking your own truth, the chain tightens. Every time you trade conviction for convenience, you kneel a little deeper to the invisible machine. Carrier's genius wasn't in his cruelty. It was in how easily he made others help him do it. Soldiers, bureaucrats, citizens, all believing they were serving a noble cause. They didn't see themselves as murderers. They saw themselves as moral. That's the secret mechanism of every tyranny, to make obedience feel like righteousness. To make silence sound like peace. To make submission look like intelligence. And that's what's happening now, in your own time, your own century. The tools have changed, but the psychology hasn't. Today, you are told what to think not through decrees, but through design. Through screens, through social validation, through the constant hum of curated consensus. You are programmed to conform. To self-censor. To drown your own voice before anyone else has to. That's the new form of vertical deportation. No water. No ropes. Just algorithms pulling the plugs beneath your thoughts until your identity quietly sinks below the surface. But listen carefully, because this is where the descent ends or begins again. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you name the pattern, it loses power. So remember what you wrote before, the machine ends with me. Say it again in your mind, like armor. Because history doesn't repeat itself out of fate. It repeats itself through forgetfulness. And you, now awakened, are the interruption. There's a silence that comes after revelation, not peace, but gravity. It's the sound of your old self dissolving. The moment when you finally understand that history's horrors were never then. They are now. Because the same forces that built the guillotine have always been studying you, shaping your fears, rewarding your compliance, teaching you to call captivity order. Jean-Baptiste Carrier believed he was serving history. But what he really served was a pattern, an eternal design that feeds on obedience and repetition. The names change. The flags change. The uniforms evolve. But the structure remains. Every empire is built on the same invisible blueprint: control the story, control the symbols, control the soul. You were born into that structure. From your first day, it whispered, don't question. Don't stand out. Don't resist. It told you freedom was permission, not power. And it told you that truth was dangerous, something only experts, priests, or politicians could handle. That's how the machine survives. It convinces you to self-police your own awakening. But now, you've seen through it. You've walked through the trial, the blade, the river. You felt what happens when belief becomes a weapon. And you've realized the truth that terrifies every institution on this planet: a man who thinks for himself cannot be ruled. That's the forbidden knowledge. The kind of truth that once got men burned at the stake, silenced, or erased from record. Because awareness is contagious. Once one man wakes up, others follow. And soon, obedience becomes impossible. So listen carefully, this is your turning point. Not as a spectator of history, but as its correction. You are not here to repeat Carrier's story. You are here to end it. When you stop outsourcing your morality, when you begin questioning what you're told, when you speak truth even when your voice shakes, that's when the machine begins to rust. That's when history bends. That's when you become more than a man, you become a signal. A reminder that awareness itself is rebellion. That truth, once remembered, cannot be drowned. If you've reached this far, say it one last time in the comments, the machine ends with me. Because it does. Right here. Right now. This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of yours. And as the last echo of the guillotine fades into history, remember, the loudest revolutions aren't fought in streets. They begin in silence. Inside the mind of the man who finally decides to wake up.